Hi, everyone. I'm going to go through a solution for the getResidentGPA function of the dorm room class. And this comes from the example from lecture using the student and dorm room class. So we'll start with a brief recap of the two classes that we're going to use here, the student and the dorm room classes. Uh, I've condensed these to just the function or the class definitions without the RMEs, just so we can get an idea for what functions are available to us from these two classes. So we'll start with the student class. The student class has some private things. Those are only accessible from within member functions of the same class. It has two values that are associated with every student, a name and a GPA. And then there are a variety of actions that we can take with the student data, and that's from these functions for the class. So we have some constructors to create new students, a series of functions to manipulate and see what the private data members are, and then a convenient function to just print the student, which would print these values, the name and the GPA. And we have a check range or check GPA function that's similar to the check range function from Project 4. For the dorm room class, we have a couple of attributes for this class. We have an array of students that are going to be the residents of the dorm room. Now, this has a capacity of max residence, which is 2. However, we're going to have another variable here that's called num residence that's going to tell us out of that max of 2, how many residents, how many students have been added to the residence array previously. And this is meant to model how many students have been added to the room. We have 4 functions, a constructor, a add resident function, get resident at, and our get resident GPA function that we're working on now. Let's go back to the get resident GPA and read the RME. Requires nothing. That is about the string parameter sname. So there's no constraints on the characters of this parameter sname. Modifies nothing. That means it is not going to print. It is not going to use cin or cout. It is not going to change any values in the residence array of student or the num residence of this class. Effects. 1. Iterates through the resident array looking for a student with name the same as sname. So name is equal to sname. Well, what is sname? That's the parameter here. So we're going to be given a name, and conceptually, we're going to look through the array of residents, searching for a student whose name matches the parameter. That is specified by the input parameter. So that's step 1, is to go through the residence array one at a time, searching those students for a name that matches the parameter. If found, returns the GPA of the student in the residence array matching sname. Right. So I've got the student.h file, the student class definition on the right-hand side, and there are 2 private data members, name and GPA. So these are 2 properties of students. And we have functions to determine what they are for a student. So we have 2 functions, getName and getGPA. We're going to use the getName function of the student class for the student with name the same as the parameter sname. And when it's found, we're going to use the getGPA function to get that student's GPA. If it's not found, we will return 0. We'll get back to the challenge problem in a minute, so we'll just focus on this for now. Let's implement the getResidentGPA. I'm going to delete my to-do comment. I'm going to go to step 1. Iterates through the residence array looking for a student with name the same as sname, that is the parameter. Iterates, loop. Great. be careful here. What we're going to put here depends on whether or not there is a member of the class that gives us the number of values that have already been added to the array. This is just a generalized way of looking at this. We have our array student residence. The capacity is max residence, which is 2. That was declared up here on line 16. However, our loop may or may not need to go through all max residence, and we'll know when it doesn't if there is another data member that tells us how many there are in this array. That's the purpose of this integer here of this class, int num residence. So this corresponds to the residence array. Num residence is going to tell us how many of the students have already been added to this class. And so we need to use this. This data member is here for a reason because a dorm room may have 0, 1, or 2 students who are residents. And we account for this with this num residence parameter, or I'm sorry, this num residence data member. If this did not exist, if this class was made and there was no data member that told you how many of this array is actively being used, then you would use max residence for your loop. But there is a attribute to record this to keep track of, are there 0, 1, or 2 students that are actively being used in this dorm room. So we will use here not max residence, but num residence. And the short way of knowing is look at the private data members. If there's an array and there's an integer that's named, telling you this fact that residence and num residence, then you're going to, in the loop, use that num residence, not max residence. If such a parameter, or if such a data member does not exist, then you would use the constant for the max number. The other clue is that we have an add resident function that will tell us, well, we're going to start with 0 people, 0 students in the dorm room and add them one at a time. So that's our loop. That's going through step 1. Now, that's part of step 1. It iterates through residence array. That's the loop. Looking for student with name is the same as S name. So looking for student, that's an if statement. With name, the same as S name, the parameter. So you have to use our array for this. So our array is residence. It's an array. We have to give a specific index. That's why I named my variable IDX here, my loop count control variable. You could name it I. The name of this variable IDX doesn't matter. It just has to be a variable. So that is our array. However, this is of data type student. Residence at IDX is data type student. So now I need to use my student member functions. Since the student, if I go back and look at our student here, we're trying to get the name. Name is private, so we have to use our getName function. Dot getName. That's going to return a string that is the student's name. Check if that is equal to S name, the parameter. And of course, this is all wrapped up in if residence get name is the same as S name. If that's the case, if that's true, then you found a match. If found, returns the GPA of the student in the residence array matching the name. Well, we know the student that matched the name. It's residence at index IDX. But here, we need to get the GPA because that's what we're going to return. And what are we going to do with that? We're going to return it. and that is a function call. So iterates through the residence array. That's line 25. Looking for a student with name the same as S name. That's line 26. That is specified by the input parameter. This is kind of redundant here. S name is the input parameter. If found, returns the GPA of the student in residence array matching that. So that part of the RME is line 27. Otherwise, return 0. Now be careful. Do not do this. This is an extremely common mistake that we see when grading exams. This if and otherwise are not mutually exclusive. The if found returns the GPA of the student. This is not an else for that same if statement. Because if you look at this loop, so the loop is for num residents, number of times executing the body of the loop. But if you look at the if-else statement, guaranteed for the very first element of the residence array, you're going to be returning a value. So this function would work if the student was found as the first person, the first student in the residence array. If the student was in the second element, if num students or num residents was 2, and this person we're looking for, this name we're looking for is in the second element of the array, this solution is not going to work. When you have an if-else statement with these returns inside of a loop, this loop can execute at most one time because you're either going to return this GPA or return 0 on the very first iteration of this loop. Be careful for this. Very common mistake. We don't want to return 0 there. We want to return 0 after we've completely exhausted our search through the entire loop and never having found the matching name. After that is where we can safely say that there is no resident with the same name in this dorm room. And that is the complete implementation of this function. Now let's see how we would actually call this function and how could we test this function. So to test the function, we need to call it. We need to predict what is going to happen when we use the function, call the function, see what happens, and then compare it to our expectations. So we have to build up to this. This dorm room getResidentGPA function, in order to call that, we need to first create a dorm room. So we're going to use the only constructor we have, the default constructor. I'll just call it dorm room. Or I'll just name the variable room of data type dorm room. If we say room dot get resident GPA, and then we provide a name like Dom, we say so what do we actually expect this to result? And this should print 0. That's not a very interesting test. It is a test to see if the function will return 0. So this is one test because we haven't added any students yet. So we would never find anything, and we should get this return 0 here. To be able to test the rest of this function, the for loop and to see if it can find a resident and return their GPA, we're going to need to add students to our dorm room variable. So if we're going to add residents with our add resident function, we're going to need the input for this function, which is a student variable. So I've created two students. I want to have two students because I want to see if I can find both of them, the first element of the array and the second element of the array of residents. So I've gone ahead and created a student variable and called the add resident function from the room to add these residents, both Dom and Sal. Now I can check. I know that Dom was the first resident that I added to the room. And Dom's GPA would be 4.0, so I should expect this should print 4. And indeed, it did find Dom and printed Dom's GPA. Should be 4, actual 4. And indeed, it does print 4. Let's see if we can find Sal. And it found Sal in the residence array and correctly returned Sal's GPA of 2. Note that the default behavior of cout when printing doubles is if there's nothing but zeros to the right of the decimal point, it will not print the decimal point or any of the zeros. And that's why the double prints as 4 and 2 here. Let's go back and do the challenge problem. Your solution must use getResidentAdd. The getResidentAdd is this function right above. Student getResidentAdd requires index greater than or equal to 0 and less than num residence, modifies nothing, returns a student from residence array at index. If we look at our getResidentAdd function, we simply return residence of the index. If we see the commonality here, return or the residence at an index, we have that same thing here. So in our original getResidentGPA function, we were directly using the residence array. If we're instead asked to use the getResidentAt function, in our getResidentGPA function, we won't use the array. We'll use the getResidentAt function to access the array. So everywhere we're using residence, we're going to replace this. Now we're calling the member function getResidentAt, giving it the index from the for loop. This is going to return a student variable. So it's going to get the student at that index. That's going to give us the student variable here. Then we can get the name of that student. Repeat again for getting the resident, retrieving that resident, and then getting their GPA. Here we're not going to directly use the residence array. We're going to use the getResidentAt function instead for each of these indices. We're going to get the resident and then get their name and GPA. And for this, we do not need any other test cases. Our current test cases should work the same. We just have an alternate implementation of the function. And when we run our code, we see that our test cases still show us that our implementation is correct. And that is the end of this exercise.